So to me, purpose is really tied to just a feeling of inspiration, you know, a feeling of kind of an aliveness where you feel not directed by something outside, but inwardly. Something gives me energy, I feel inspired, and that's the way I tend to move in all areas of life, you know. Earlier in my life, I think I thought of purpose and related to it in a much more conventional sense, and I experienced it that way, you know. Different parts of our life, often depending on what we're interested in, what captures our imagination, we kind of feel like and think, that's my purpose, you know, that's my reason for being. Or if we have a goal that we've set up, that becomes a kind of purpose. But I think the whole definition of purpose, and certainly the human experience of it, in my experience has changed, you know, almost as our consciousness evolves. I think our experience of purpose evolves with it. And it becomes a little bit less sort of goal-oriented, and I think it starts to become, purpose becomes an expression of a kind of inspired energy. You know, I think it becomes an expression of what we love and what we cherish. So that's how I kind of relate to purpose at this point.
Yeah. Do you see sort of levels of purpose? So in my life, one of my purposes is to just enjoy, right? So live jazz, downhill skiing feels like a purpose for me. But then there's a layer of purpose beyond self. And so could you sort of tease apart for you the way you understand, I use the word soul, that there are soul level purposes and ego level purposes. Do you see it that way? And if so, how do you?
Sure, I think the ego level purposes are often kind of tied with goals. And, you know, when we're more in a kind of our ego kind of consciousness, often our goals are a kind of unconscious attempt to fulfill something that we feel like we lack. You know, often we're not aware that that's what's happening, but we're often trying to sort of fill up a hole or fill up something that we feel like, that we lack in life. And so our purposes are much more defined not only by ourselves, but often they're tied in with the people around us, with our culture. Each culture has its sort of, you know, orientation that it thinks a good, successful life goes. So I think often in the ego, purpose in their biggest sense is often tied into a sense of achievement and success. And rightly so, because that's just how that level of consciousness operates. You just mentioned a kind of soul purpose. And I think then we're into something, when we start to evolve and we come into a whole different experience of purpose that often initially is confusing. I find this all the time when the sort of more ego-centered drives, and just to be clear, to me, I don't look at ego with any kind of negative connotation. It's just a particular type of consciousness, and it's a particular way of experiencing the world and oneself, you know. So from the ego's point of view, like I said, we're often trying to compensate. But when we start to evolve, when our sense of who we are starts to expand outside of the ego, then we literally come into a more selfless experience of life. Now, when we first do that, it's confusing because all of our old touch points for what purpose is came from an ego consciousness, something that was more self-centered. And so when we move into a kind of new domain, when that energy is no longer the thrust that pushes us through life and achievement and success, we kind of often go through this phase where I find people often feel kind of disoriented. The old purposes and meanings to their life don't seem to be relevant, and yet a new, more selfless, kind of inspired way of living hasn't kind of come online yet. So we almost always go through a kind of a limbo between these two ways of being. And for most people, it takes time. It's the object of their meditation. It's the object of their inquiry. They got to dig down pretty deep to see, like, what is this? What is driving me to do this? So in that sense, it's really getting in touch with their direction.
So is this, so for me, there's two nearly distinct inquiries. One of them is to wake up, to know, I used to call it as a 12-year-old, ultimate truth. Mm-hmm. Had to know what that was. And then there's another inquiry, which is, how can I be of service? Mm-hmm. And they feel somewhat distinct. So the question is, are they distinct? And to the extent that they are, how can they mutually support each other?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the end, everything kind of comes together, but in human experience, they're often very distinct. The impulse, what I call the enlightenment impulse, it's kind of irrational in a certain sense, right? Because it will drive you whether you like it or don't, whether sometimes it will drive you to actually suffer more sometimes as it's driving you to become more conscious. Sometimes it won't. It seems to be independent of sort of the pleasure principle, where we're simply seeking to have the best, most beautiful possible experience. Because when I find when people start small, it's almost, you practice it in the least, practice it where it's easiest. You know, don't wait until you're having a big confrontation with your partner or your boss, you know, because then you'll have fear and you'll be attached. And start with just little moments that really there's nothing on the line, that seem unimportant, and endeavor to do that. Because what I found over the years, when people start to do that in the small ways, then it starts to naturally connect in the bigger dimensions. And they sort of open this window inside themselves where the bigger directions for their lives, how they can contribute in a bigger way, right, in a more inclusive way, start to flow out of these little connection points. So when we're trying to make this leap, it's often too big a leap. These little connection points sort of walk you there, and then it's like the inner doorways and it starts to be open. And you're paying attention to it, and you're trying to relate from it. So it stays open when you're relating, you know, when you're dealing with your life.
It's interesting, you used the word grounded depth, and I'm wondering if you perceive in yourself or in others that when the central inquiry is the enlightenment impulse, as you said, it can sometimes feel like a transcendent, widening, opening, even kind of an up and out of ego. But when the inquiry is, what do I do? What is my place and my service? It can feel like a burrowing into our depth, into the ground, into the earth even. Mm-hmm. Does that resonate?
It absolutely does, because it goes to something that the way I kind of counsel with people around this is, if we talk, let's say, you have a more spacious, open sense of being. It's very airy. It's very spacious, right? Literally, kinesthetically spacious and airy and vast. And what I'll do is to try to get it here. Like, how does that feel? How does that same a sense of wide open being or presence, how does it feel in your body? Like, how does it feel in your chest? How does it feel in your gut? If you were to say, this is the way my gut experiences wide open presence, and you start to notice it takes on a different quality, right? It takes on literally a more grounded quality, because you're grounding this kind of realization literally into the body. So to me, that's an interesting, I like that frame of, you can be a redeeming presence in your life. And all it takes is to begin with, yes. But it's a mess, yes. But I'm so unenlightened, yes. Start with yes.
This word you've been using, redemption, redeeming. It speaks so eloquently to what I think the purpose of purpose is. Yeah. And you were talking about Jesus, and you might be familiar with this term from his own tradition, Judaism, tikkun olam, to heal and repair the world. So I guess there's a question about heartbreak. There's a, you know better than I, in Buddhism, there are some teachings which exemplify the arahat, the one who doesn't return to the world and awakens up and out of it, and apparently would go walking off into unbounded, non-dual bliss. But there's another stream which sometimes the word bodhisattva returns. And so two questions. Well, one is, are these just both equal but different expressions, different paths for different people, that the non-dual teachings can lead to a kind of a solitary life, not overtly looking like an act of service or interacting with people or animals or so forth, or on the other hand, this other one. So just, I guess that's the first question, the arahat versus the bodhisattva.
Yeah, that wonderful distinction that are made in that Buddhist tradition between the arahat and the bodhisattva. As often is the case, I find the truth of the matter lies in a kind of an embrace of a kind of paradox. In one sense, let's say kind of a conventional sense, I think that the arahat mentality, I just want to wake up to the truth of being, find that place inside that's beyond space and time, and that's it. Maybe I'll stay in a cave, maybe I won't, go out and try to save the world or anything. And then the more the bodhisattva ideal, which the bodhisattva ideal, I think it's important to realize it's based on a fundamental realization. I would argue that it's based on a deeper realization than the arahant view. The bodhisattva view is based on literally realizing that samsara, this relative everyday life that we're all living, samsara is nirvana. That's the realization. Or if you put it in theistic terms, you want God, this is God, right here. That garbage can over there, that's God. That tree, that flower, that polluted city. And I'm not talking about that we believe it or think it, but we can really experience life that way. And when we do experience life that way, then to retreat from life makes no sense. Where am I going? If I've actually seen that it's real, all God, or as Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth and men do not see it. By God, if I really see that, there's literally nowhere else to go. And I think then the sort of what it calls forth in us, and calls forth quite naturally, is a kind of being a redemptive presence, or at least a benevolent presence in the world, is almost the only thing that makes sense, that feels good or feels right or feels aligned, The paradox is that, having said that I also think simultaneously that we all have our own way that truth is lived out. Even enlightenment, it's not like if everybody was enlightened, we'd all do the same thing. We'd be just as diverse as life is right now, maybe diverse in different ways. But there would be some people who'd be really called to be activists and various types and, all manner of trying to help humanity in the world. And there would be other people that would be called simply to just be. And they wouldn't be involved in. And I wouldn't put either one on a hierarchical scale of more or less enlightened. Even people that see that the world, nirvana, samsara and nirvana are one, that this is the living manifestation of God, you could say. they can still have it can have different outcomes. One person, it inspires them to great involvement, the other person not. So in one sense, I think there's a deepening of realization that's reflected, but even if there's the same sort of truly non-dual realization, it's not that everyone will go out and try to save the world. There can be many, many, many different responses to that, to the same realization.